It's not my Maryland. It's not your Maryland. It's our Maryland. Welcome to Maryland, our Maryland. My name is Louis Miserendino, and I'm excited to be alongside Dr. Anirban Basu, the CEO of Sage Policy Group. Welcome to another episode where today we plan to talk a lot about the Key Bridge, the Francis Scott Key Bridge. And of course, we want to do some history as well this time. We want to talk a little bit about who the man was, Francis Scott Key, and some of the Marylanders, the people and the places in Maryland that set the stage for the history that he made at the site of the bridge that was eventually built to name him. So let's start with the economics, Anirban. It's been more than 2 years now since a giant cargo ship, the Dolly, crashed into the Francis Scott Key Bridge. The bridge collapsed. 6 workers lost their lives on that day. And the impact that the bridge collapse has had on the area has been significant now for 2 years in running.
Right. So this is March of 2024. The bridge collapses, hit by that Dolly ship. And immediately, of course, the regional economy is waylaid. Of course, by the way, those 6 workers who were killed were working on the bridge at that time, and all foreign-born, as it turns out. But setting that aside, focusing today on Francis Scott Key, the immediate impact was estimated around $15 million per day, because the port, as you'll remember, was effectively shut down. Ships could not get in and out to the port, from the port, et cetera. And so now, of course, as the bridge is cleared, the port becomes operational. It actually had its second best year on record last year, which speaks to, by the way, some amazing Marylanders who work at the Port of Baltimore. And sometimes we don't recognize enough how many amazing people there are in Maryland and in Baltimore. The folks at the Maryland Port Authority are brilliant people, and they do amazing work, and they keep the port competitive despite some arguable disadvantages, including the 8-hour trip up the Chesapeake Bay. But setting all that aside, major impacts. Now, the community is still not recovered. We still have this big hole in our Beltway, of course. Commuting times have become much longer, whether you're on the west side of the Beltway or the east side of the Beltway. And the Baltimore County economy in particular is not recovered. So in March of 2024, the number of people who were living in Baltimore County with a job was around 433,000. It's not down to 428,000. And my theory, at least, is that many of those jobs were lost on the east side of the county. That many of those people have left. They might live in other counties. They might have left Maryland altogether. We don't know. But the damage is persistent. We need that bridge up and running. Speaking of which, a few weeks after the bridge's collapse, it was estimated that the cost to rebuild the bridge would be around $1.9 billion and would be completed by 2028. And then came the late 2025 estimate. All of a sudden, it was $5.2 billion, 2030. And then, earlier this year, of course, Kiewit, the general contractor who was responsible for rebuilding the bridge or overseeing the rebuilding of the bridge, they come out of Omaha, Nebraska, by the way. They're one of the largest engineering and construction firms in the country. They're fired. And presumably because the bid came in much higher than the state government wanted, which means much more than $5.2 billion. And that's where we are. And so we have a hole in our Beltway, a hole in that donut. We want that bridge. We need that bridge. And it's going to be a long time before we get it.
Yeah, but before the bridge collapsed, it used to accommodate on average 34,000 vehicles a day. And so many of those vehicles now can take the Fort McHenry tunnel or the Harbor Tunnel, but traffic is much higher in both tunnels. Any truck carrying hazardous materials, though, is not permitted in either tunnel. So those trucks now have to go all the way around the Baltimore Beltway. They have to take a journey of more than 20 miles to make up for the loss of the bridge. And so the impact that we've noticed day to day is significant. There's all kinds of survey data as well, Anirban. So many businesses knew early on that the loss of the Key Bridge would be significant. And it's already been 2 years. It's now looking like it may easily be 4 more years. Why does it seem like these major projects, they always experience cost overruns? They always experience delays. Why is that such a common thing?
It's a common thing because in construction, you have so many different components. You've got so many subcontractors. You've got to order the materials. And so you've got to have the right equipment. And so obviously we've been dealing with supply chain issues for time immemorial, but particularly with the pandemic and since the pandemic. In late 2024, so a few months after the bridge collapsed, Donald John Trump is reelected president of the United States. Number 45 becomes number 47. And then his administration, among other things, promulgates tariffs on steel, 50%, aluminum, 50%, copper, 50%. And so with all these tariffs, including tariffs on other goods, Section 232 tariffs and other tariffs, Liberation Day tariffs, all of a sudden costs have gone way up. If you look at construction materials prices since February of 2020, and February of 2020 is the month before you shut down the economy, construction materials prices are up 51.3% in this country. And many of the sharpest price increases have been in energy, as it turns out, but also metals, structural metal products, fabricated metal products, so on and so forth. And so the estimate has gone up. Of course, workers are in short supply. So you don't find a lot of people in the general population who are able to work on bridges, who have that kind of background, right? We haven't trained those people for a few decades now. You don't find many bridge painters, but you need all these people to refashion this bridge. And so you put it all together, the average construction project is over budget and delayed, but this is not the average construction project. This is much more involved, and you've had some things happening in between the collapse and rebuilding that have further driven up costs.
Is there any hope that this gets done in fewer than 4 years, or does it seem likely to you that it's going to be around 2030 or maybe even later?
I would put higher odds on the Orioles winning a World Series in the next 4 years. I mean, really, just to give you some, I'm not actually joking about that.
Hopefully both happen.
Well, yeah, that's Kazeel, right? Come on, Gunner. But yeah, hopefully both happen, but it's very complicated. You need permits. We don't even have a general contractor now, right? Because Kiewit was fired. So now you're going to go through this process of finding a new general contractor. And what hope is there that their bid, their estimate of how much it's going to cost to replace the bridge will be lower than what Kiewit, they're dealing with the same materials prices, same set of subcontractors, same region of the country, same diesel fuel prices, et cetera. And so the goal, of course, the hope is, the bridge is going to cost, but the federal government will come through. And we just don't know if the federal government is going to come through.
And it would seem unlikely that any kind of general contractor would be able to actually buy the materials before securing the job. So they can't really be sure of what they're going to pay for the materials until they commit to buying them. Is that right? Is it hard to lock in?
They can lock in prices, futures, and so on and so forth contracts, and they can do that. But you're absolutely right that, I mean, why would I have an order for steel pending?
Right, you have that kind of stuff sitting around unless you knew you were going to be able to use it on a bridge.
Particularly now, right? Because you're leveraging the balance sheet to buy steel or aluminum or whatever it happens to be, and then you have to pay for storing those metals. And you have to insure the storage of those metals. So why would I do that? So I'm going to get the contract with the state of Maryland to rebuild the bridge. The state of Maryland, meanwhile, has to figure out, well, how much money can we get from parties that are responsible for this chaos, whether it's the ship owner. Some of this has already been settled, by the way, $2 billion here, so on and so on. So that's good. But there are more cases pending, as it turns out. The legal process takes time. So all of these things are happening. Of course, we don't know if the federal government is going to pay 100% of this because, when President Biden was president, he said, we're going to pay for this bridge. But now Donald John Trump is president. He's saying, I don't know. And in fact, you only have one congressional representative who's Republican, Andy Harris, of course, people know. And he's been suggesting that the federal government should not write a blank check to Maryland to finance this. Now, I'm not a big fan of that positioning.
Why would he say that?
I guess it's a matter of principle, right? It's like, I want to be fiscally disciplined. Okay. But here's the thing, Louis. Our state needs the money, and we need that bridge. Okay. We already face a structural fiscal shortfall, right? So, and we're spending capital like crazy on, Oil Park Camden Yards and M&T Bank Stadium and, Pimlico Racetrack. And now we want to expand the convention center downtown and, and then you got the bridge, right? So capital dollars are really spoken for already in the state. We need that federal money. We need it. And so I'm not a big fan of this Andy Harris position, even though it might be principled. It's not pragmatic.
Besides the disruption to trade, we've had a major economic impact from the loss of the Key Bridge. Of course, a major impact even socially, personally, emotionally. We had 6 people pass away on that day. But for communities that are near the bridge, so think of Curtis Bay on the west side, Dundalk, Edgemere, Sparrows Point on that side. What has the loss of the bridge meant to areas physically near where the bridge was?
Look, that part of the regional economy is about distribution. It's about transportation. It's about truck drivers. It's about freight handlers.
A lot of warehouse space, too.
And so all of a sudden, you've got a port that is less competitive than it otherwise would be. So the Port of Baltimore is a trucking port. Now, that could change as, we have dealt with the Howard Street Tunnel, and we now have the ability to double stack.
Right. So the cargo that comes into the city then get shipped elsewhere by truck instead of just by train.
Exactly, because we've had only single stacking capability with respect to our railroads.
Until recently.
So all of a sudden, the Port of Baltimore has gained some capability with this double stacking of rail containerized cargo. It's fantastic. You can carry twice as much cargo, right? That's the point. And so all of a sudden, we become a much more efficient rail port, but still I-70, I-95, all of these thoroughfares connecting us to the Midwest and the Northeast and the Southeast, et cetera. And so we've had this history of being a trucking port. And now all of a sudden we have all this excess traffic. And as you pointed out, this limitation on hazardous cargo. And you put it all together, the port can't grow in terms of volume and activity the way it otherwise would if the bridge were still there. And so that's a semi-permanent, long-term form of damage. Nonetheless, the port has done an excellent job retaining its advantages in roll-on, roll-off cargo, things like farm tractors and cars, and also, in terms of containerized cargo, so the Chesapeake Bay.
It's not unusual for Baltimore's port to be the leading importer of foreign cars for the whole country, if I'm not mistaken.
The leading roll-on, roll-off cars. And by the way, again, this speaks to human intelligence, right? We talk about AI, right, but HI, because, because, again, if you look at the people who work at the port, I'm not talking about the administrators, but the people who work at the port,
like crane operators and
longshoremen. Crane operators, no one does a better job handling the precious cargo that is, for instance, luxury automobiles, the way the Port of Baltimore people do. And that's why Jaguar and others have been bringing in their cars, and Jaguar's a bad example now at this point. But the point is, very precious cargo, and they said, we trust the Port of Baltimore more than any other people to handle this precious commodity and make sure it gets to dealerships ultimately. We trust the Port of Baltimore people. And despite what's happened with the Francis Scott Key Bridge, we continue to excel, and it's really quite remarkable.
But we still need the bridge.
Oh, we need the bridge so badly. I mean, you got a hole in the donut, and we want the donut. We want our beltway. It's our beltway.
It's the whole donut.
We want the whole beltway. We grew up with it. We've lived with it. We want it. And it has significant economic consequences for Baltimore City, Baltimore County, so on and so forth, and the Port of Baltimore. And by the way, one of the other things that's happening is the development of a new marine terminal at Trade Point Atlantic, adjacent to the Port of Baltimore. This will further expand our cargo handling capacity. So between double stacking of rail cargo and what's happening at Trade Point Atlantic and the exquisite management of the Port of Baltimore, there's a lot going for us. If we get that bridge in place, that's a grand slam.
One of the advantages that the port does have geographically is that it's inland. It's true that if you're out in the ocean on a cargo ship and you have to get to Baltimore as opposed to, say, Norfolk, you've got to come up the bay, and that takes you time. But when you get to the port, you are farther inland. And so that gets you access to be able to transport goods to places in the upper Midwest and other places in the country more quickly than you could if you stopped at a more ocean coastal port.
100%. We're, the closest Atlantic seaport to the Midwest. And so, hey, there's a reason they called it, I guess, the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad, right? It's because, that was obviously about rail. But the point is that we have just got this special affinity in terms of our distribution networks and channels with the Midwest. And of course, historically.
A railroad doesn't make its way onto the monopoly board unless it means something.
All that B&O Railroad, that made the monopoly board. And so there's Baltimore right there on the monopoly board.
Yeah, the real one, not just the local one.
And it's because of location, location, and Baltimore has it.
How are you on driving on bridges? Do you handle it well? Is it an issue for you?
Look, I think I drive no worse on bridges than I do on regular, pavement and roads. I can be an erratic driver. My mother-in-law calls me rash. She said, you're a rash driver.
Bridges.
Yeah, maybe even reckless. That's the synonym for reckless. But I handle the Bay Bridge and other bridges just fine.
That recklessness is a problem for nervous drivers like me. Boy, I have to admit, the first time I drove on the Chesapeake Bay Bridge after the collapse of the Key Bridge, I definitely wondered how much it was going to be in my head. And it was a little bit. I found myself looking both ways across the bay to see if a ship was, like I could do anything about it if I saw it. And I was actually doing pretty well. I was coming from the eastern shore back to the western shore. And right when I got to the height of the bridge, you're way up above the bay when you reach the height of the bridge. I was also at the height of my confidence, and suddenly traffic slowed down. And so I thought, uh-oh. I got this real hot feeling come over my head. I started looking around. I mean, you can see so many parts of Maryland from up there. It's very pretty if you're not scared. And I had to be calmed down. The wonderful Mrs. M, my wife, was riding shotgun. This totally meant nothing to her. She was completely fine. But as the traffic slowed down and then I started to hear sirens, I got pretty nervous. And the authorities did a great job of clearing everything quickly and getting the cars moving again. But the slowdown turned out to be because of a mattress lost on the bridge. It was just lying there in the right lane, like somebody was ready to take a nap right there in the slow lane. And I thought that was a little bit funny. But then when I drove by, I realized, you know what? That's something else to be afraid of. Could you imagine being on a small craft in the bay and you get blindsided by a mattress falling from the bridge?
Look, did any one of us think before March of 2024 that what happened could have happened? Now, I suppose somebody imagined it, right? There are engineers out there. Other bridges have been hit by ships historically, but that our bridge would just fold like a cheap tent like it did?
Well, it wasn't a cheap tent.
No, I don't blame the bridge. I blame the owners of the dolly or whomever I'm going to blame. But the point is, when you look at the video, you're like, oh my goodness, what's going on? Why this bridge just crumbled? In any case, one of the questions has been, should there have been better defenses for the bridge, right? Other communities have done that for their bridges, their major,
protection
bridges
of the support
on the
structures.
side, the supportive structure and so on and so forth. And we actually actively made decisions, or at least our policymakers, not to engage in those expenditures. And in hindsight, I think we can agree those were pretty poor decisions. But again, it's hindsight, and hindsight is 2020.
Right. It's very difficult to determine, I'd say even on an individual basis, what the right amount of money to spend is on a very low probability event. How much would you be willing to buy as a regular person lightning insurance that will pay your medical bills if you're hit by lightning, knowing that it's very unlikely? If it's tough to figure out what the right amount of coverage is necessary, what the right amount of money to spend is for low probability events. And I don't know if the officials did it right or wrong. I just would think that it's a tough thing. You would need to talk to some heavy hitters, some good minds, some good consultants before figuring out something like that.
Right. And the other thing is that often low probability events are catastrophic if they are to occur.
That's right.
And so not only is the insurance related to a low probability event, and therefore potentially there's greater potential for money to be wasted, but then the insurance is very expensive because if that event occurs, the damage is catastrophic. And so the path of least resistance is to simply not buy that insurance, not make those expenditures to defend the bridge. And so I'm not criticizing. I'm saying in hindsight, if we had known what was going to happen, obviously we would have taken steps to defend our bridge.
Yeah, it seems like the company that owns the Dolly also was not prepared for one of their ships to have an accident of that magnitude.
They weren't prepared at all. And based on what I've seen, rather irresponsible in terms of how they handled the situation. And the ship had shown signs of malfunctioning before all this happened. And so anyway, I'll leave it to the lawyers and all these to figure those things out. And the engineers, we need our bridge, man. But I will say this, that once we get it, you'll see a flurry of new investment, right? All of those investments that have not taken place around the Port of Baltimore that would have taken place, now all of a sudden begin to take place. And then, oh, by the way, you wake up to a new day with double stacking because the Howard Street Tunnel is no longer the bottleneck that it has been. And so, my goodness, I think there's some real upside here in terms of our distribution sector. And that creates a lot of jobs, blue collar, some white collar jobs, tend to be middle class or better jobs. And so, look, I know we have some issues as a state economy right now, but when you look around and you see some of the opportunities in front of us, things can get a lot better really quickly.
Well, that's good. It's good to have a little bit of optimism. So the Key Bridge, Anirban, it's called the Francis Scott Key Bridge. You've been a Marylander for a long time. What's the basic story that you've always heard about Francis Scott Key, the man, the historical figure?
Look, I don't know much. You're the historian here. So I know War of 1812, 1814, Baltimore rescues the country. But I know there's a lot of focus right now on the 250-year anniversary of the Declaration of Independence. But at the end of the day, if it's not for Baltimore in 1814, this nation doesn't exist, right? We're all speaking English, like English people, right? And so Francis Scott Key, of course, as I understand it there, writes our Star-Spangled Banner. It's a beautiful poem. It's a beautiful song. And every time I see a sporting event and somebody singing the Star-Spangled Banner, I say, oh, that was written in Baltimore.
I think many locals feel that way. You feel like there's something that's ours about the national anthem, that we're glad it's the national anthem. When you look at that inside page on your passport, I think yours would be the same as mine unless it's really old. There's a giant image of Francis Scott Key looking out over the water, and some of the words of the Star-Spangled Banner are right there in large print on the inside of every United States passport, all 50 states. And so there's been something important about this event to locals for a long time. And I think you summarize the story as many of us know it. We know that near the site of the bridge, Francis Scott Key, the person in 1814, witnessed Fort McHenry successfully defended against an attempted British invasion. And he was so excited after the success that he wrote a poem that eventually became our national anthem. And at the surface level, I guess that's an interesting story. It's a good local story. But when you dig just a little bit deeper, Anirban, I think that this is a very Maryland story. Sure, it's a story of the flag. It's a story of the national anthem. It's a story of Baltimore. But it's a Maryland story as well. It's a Maryland project that involves many places in Maryland and many Marylanders providing some sort of contextualization for the big moment when Francis Scott Key wrote the poem that became the Star-Spangled Banner. So I wanted to chat about that a little bit today. I wanted to talk a little bit about what Maryland was like way back in 1814.
Let's do it, Louis. Look, I mean, this is a weird thing because I know this is history, but I'm on the edge of my seat. I don't know what you're about to say and what's about to happen, so let's hear it.
Good. Now, there isn't an entire classroom here of individuals that I can call on, so I'm going to have to call on you sometimes, Anirban. You're going to have to be paying attention quite carefully.
All right.
And before we zoom back into Maryland and Baltimore, let's zoom out and talk about some of the national and global context of that event. You mentioned it earlier, the War of 1812. It was the United States against the British, but this is not the American Revolution. The Revolution ended many years earlier. We gained our independence from the British in the late 1700s. But this War of 1812 was the first declared war of the country after the Revolution. And there were a handful of major reasons that the country decided to go to war with such a powerful empire in 1812. One of the top reasons was a British naval practice called impressment. They were impressing American sailors. Now, this kind of impressment, it's not like when you start showing off your watches to try and impress someone, making eyes with people, the peacock feathers, that kind of thing. This impressment was basically kidnapping. A British ship might pull you over in your ship and say, hey, I think a bunch of these American sailors here, they're not actually Americans. They're British deserters. So they got to come work for us now. And sometimes the British were right. Sometimes these were British deserters, but other times they were just kidnapping Americans. I think by the thousands, I've often heard. And so a lot of Americans became resentful of the British stealing sailors, kidnapping them. And the British at this time were involved in Napoleonic wars with France while Napoleon was in charge. So they needed sailors. They wanted to disrupt foreign trade with France. They were very disruptive of American trade. And so a lot of Americans were just irritated with the British. So much so that there was a group of people known as Warhawks who really pushed President Madison to go to war with the British. There were even many expansionists in the country at that time. They thought that the British were too friendly with Native Americans out west, and that was interfering with the U.S. acquiring new territory, or really inhabiting territory that was already part of the U.S. in the U.S.'s mind. And there were also Americans who wanted to conquer Canada. They legitimately thought that the conquest of Canada was a good idea, and they thought it would help the country if we just took over the whole darn thing. So these expansionists, these Warhawks, people who were upset with the British Navy, put pressure on Madison and the ruling party to go to war, and a war began in 1812. We call it the War of 1812, but they were still fighting in 1814. They were still fighting a few years later. How's that so far? You feel good about that global context?
I'm on the edge of my seat. That's fantastic.
So
I'm impressment.
But that gives us the present-day story of the Francis Scott Key Bridge and the broader conflict that brought the British back to Maryland in 1814. In part two, we'll zoom in on the Marylanders, communities, and events that led Francis Scott Key to witness the defense of Fort McHenry and write the words that became our national anthem.
I'm very interested in the part where this is a Maryland project. I'm very interested in that.
Very good. Well, until next time then, my name's Louis Miserendino, and for Dr. Anirban Basu, this is Maryland, Our Maryland.
Maryland, Our Maryland is produced in partnership with Suited. For podcast production, digital strategy, and creative support, visit looksuited.com.